I'd like to, we've heard a lot about foster care in the UK, so as I said, I'm going to try and take this beyond the borders of the UK now to sort of provide a little bit of background and context. I really want to talk about two main things. The first is the way that refugees and asylum seekers in the world are generally mistrusted by the governments that encounter them, or the services that encounter them, and also how children are not always believed. Their accounts are sometimes discredited or mistrusted. I mean, we've got lots of examples in the UK at the moment about children not being believed. Rotherham springs to mind, Manchester springs to mind. So it's those two main strands that I want to focus on today. And part of that is about disclosure, and a disclosure of abuse being incredibly difficult. So children disclosing abuse, maltreatment, exploitation in that context. Okay. So what I'd like to look at is the experiences of displaced children throughout the experience of being forcibly displaced. I'm not talking about all migrant children here, just forced displacement. And the issue of trust and mistrust throughout that entire journey towards a future emplacement, because we have to think of, as Turton points out here, about the loss of a place, but we also have a struggle to make a place in the world. It's not only about loss and trauma and all of those things that we tie ourselves up with. It's also about what's happening in that child's life to actually make that place as well. Okay. So to do this, I look at the entire migration journey. I will look at different stages of forced displacement. I'll also consider internal displacement within countries without crossing borders, thinking about trust and mistrust throughout the process. I'll touch upon political violence and interpersonal violence, and get to a place, hopefully, if I have time, to talk about some form of emplacement as well. Okay. I'm not drawing on any particular research project. I'm drawing on sort of my practitioner experiences and lots of different research projects that I've been involved with over time that have all sort of cumulatively taken me to this point where I think that this issue of mistrusting asylum seekers and refugees is, you know, sort of a main point throughout all of the studies that I've worked with, and also the experiences actually in the field that I've had. So the struggle to sort of regain trust, restore trust. I'm not just talking about trust as a sort of an abstract concept, but trust in people, trust in officials, who it is we trust and mistrust, and why. And also how mistrust is sometimes, for children going through this, a useful survival strategy, actually. To mistrust particular people at particular points in time is quite a useful thing for a child's survival. Okay. So, I'm not going to look at this bit. I'm only going to look at this bit. You'll be relieved to hear. I'm conscious that putting things in boxes like this doesn't reflect reality. It's fairly arbitrary how we divide these things up, but it's just a convenient conceptual tool, really. All children won't have gone through all of these stages. A trafficked child, for example, won't have potentially reached an urban refugee situation. This is just sort of a convenient framework to sort of talk about these things, really. I'm also not going to look at repatriation or deportation or these issues around emplacement too much, because I don't think we know a great deal about that in literature. These boxes are sometimes referred to as the sort of refugee experience, so people moving through all of these things. Okay. This is a more fluid way of looking at it. This is the sort of militarisation going on, normal life happening, suddenly having to flee with babies on your back, possessions on your back, etc. Moving across borders, crossing rivers with inflatable tubes around you so you don't drown, and arriving in different countries. So just sort of to show that this experience is definitely fluid. Everybody is familiar with the 1951 Refugee Convention, I'm sure. So the first stage, as Zollberg has suggested, is the restructuring of a social order of a nation state is in itself a refugee generating process. So if you have different groups vying for control and for power, and they are mobilizing different people along, quite often, the lines of race, religion, nationality, social group and political opinion, you will get people mistrusting each other in that process. All refugee status determination processes around the world begin at a point where the burden of proof is on the individual to prove that they are being persecuted. So it begins at a point where children or adults are having to sort of prove, whether it's real or perceived, their persecution from other people. So sometimes this pans out as people becoming child soldiers. If you have, for example, this child here is a part of the Karen National Union, the KNU, along the Thai-Burma border. They had been recruited at the tender age of 12 and brought in and mobilised to actually go to the front line and shoot people perceived to not be Karen. So what you quite often get is mistrust around either real or perceived connections. Quite often children will have seen friends and family jailed, killed or tortured, and they may have been in hiding during that process due to their political loyalties or any other point of their persecution. So, for those who remain inside borders, we have this internal displacement, this phenomena of internal displacement, where people may not cross a border, they may remain within the country of origin and become de facto stateless. This family here were found after walking into Burma by about 2 hours, 3 hours, and they were hiding in the jungle. They'd been there for several weeks, hiding, moving from place to place, so that they couldn't be found by soldiers or anybody else in officialdom. Okay. What is really important, I think, is that this is another picture of internally displaced people moving around in very small groups so that they remain undetected. The children, who you can see in the centre of here, are always kept very quiet. They learn very quickly to stay quiet in those situations, not to make a noise, not to go astray. And potentially this family would have found this clearing in advance of the actual persecution happening. So they may have seen the writing on the wall, and they may have put rice stores around the place so that they knew that they could go to this clearing at some point if Burmese soldiers came in and started doing what Burmese soldiers do, killing and raping and torturing. I think this family was slowly making their way to a border, but sometimes people don't. They just move around within the country of origin. They were about 4 hours away from the border, hiding at night. They'd been on the move for something like 2 weeks. But always quietly, and always to sort of avoid detection. So the types of other forms of abuse that may happen that are state-sponsored within countries of origin often are around the issue of child soldiers. And this child, for example, had experienced being recruited at the age of 13 and was put in this big barracks and was given this sort of military training day in, day out, and the types of abuse this child was experiencing were just incredible, having to beat 250 people in the regiment to essentially be a part of that like infantry brigade. So agents of the state recruiting children into the army, and this child learning about physical abuse in a fairly dramatic and violent way. Now, that's about the refugee process. With trafficking, I think we have to keep an eye on this issue of trust because of the sort of control mechanisms that traffickers quite often use. They will try to, they will have some sort of form of intimate knowledge of the specific familial, socio-economic backgrounds, civil and political vulnerabilities of particular children. We found this in a study that we did with Professor Jenny Pierce with the NSPCC, and this was found that this issue of trust, within one of the case files, one person had sort of manipulated a child to come across based specifically on the fact that they knew this child was not happy in their home. So they sort of used the difficulties within the family to then mobilise and take that child and exploit them elsewhere. So there's always a point in time where people decide, adults or children decide, right, that's it. Enough writing on the wall, we can't continue this way. It's time to go, it's time to leave. So there'll be a point in time where potentially the family will sit down and they will talk about that decision to flee. In this example here, we have a 13-year-old boy who'd been captured by Burmese soldiers. And notice, constantly, it's about Karen versus the Burmese, or the Karenni versus the Burmese. So the differences are always very prominent and very much exploited. So he'd been forced to walk for 14 days to reach a military base, sleeping in the jungle en route, managed to escape on the 4th night. That's it, I can't take this anymore. I'll go out for water and I will escape. And came to the Thai refugee camp because that was the only route out he could find. And he's talking about the soldiers making these women that had been captured, 9 women that had been captured, dance and drink with the soldiers, having their arms grabbed, how they were sleeping, the sleeping arrangements, all of those types of things. So if we think about the types of disclosures that children will need to make in the future, imagine how difficult it would be to disclose this type of information. What's missing in this narrative are issues around sexual violence because of the shame and the stigma of sex within for children, but also sexual violence and the shame on the community, that if this young 13-year-old boy had talked about that, his whole community would suffer. So very similar to the sort of honour types of circumstances that we talk about within the UK. Okay, so in flight, we go into flight, we're running away, and we have soldiers running, young women and children and families running away, because the babies are crying. The babies are you can't stop a baby from crying, so they're running away. They've left behind their sick and their old people, and it's only the young and the healthy who are moving, who are on the move. It was the only way. Coming to Thailand was the only way to survive. So we're running away from officials, we're running away from soldiers, we're running away from anybody perceived to be an agent of the state. Okay, and this is how they do it. In small groups, taking the babies and however many possessions you can carry on your back. In small groups, avoiding detection at all costs. And then, finally, whoopee-doo, we think we get to a refugee camp and all will be fine. Sadly not. Okay. Refugee camps are really lousy and horrendous places. This particular picture is of Vietnamese refugees having to move their belongings every 2 weeks so that they are made to feel temporary, so that they don't settle, so that they can't feel as though they're settling in that country. Very often, every couple of weeks, this was the rigmarole. I think refugee status determination processes around the world, as I mentioned, are very variable, but they're quite similar to the process through which asylum seekers go through in the UK. So they're very much based on the burden of proof is on the individual to prove that they're being persecuted. What we have in the camps is overcrowded accommodation, rations at survival level, no international NGOs there doing trainings and all of those types of things which would make life bearable. And refugees on this particular camp were kept at a subsistence level below that of the lowest Thai national, so that we have this deterrence, this humane deterrence, it was referred to stop people wanting to settle and stay. And children were very much a part of that sort of care and control and uncertainty context. I think as Judith spoke about care and control in the UK, very much the same in refugee camps overseas. This one here is quite an intriguing one. It was actually on Facebook, so a project looking at social media. It's about Vietnamese refugees who lived on a camp 25 years ago, and what they're saying now, what are the stories that are coming out now about their experiences on camps then? So 25 years later, what is it that's being presented through social media? You can't really see it, but there's a manhole cover here connecting two different parts of the camp. And an 8-year-old boy had gone through the camp and ended up in jail for three hours. He, he came out quite sort of, on Facebook at least, quite proud of the sort of treats he got when he came out, because he'd been through this experience of avoiding the authorities, but then being found out. So we're not going through checkpoints when we're using this. So, okay. So there's a few more things about the refugee camp and the UK, but what we've done now is we've skipped to the penultimate slide, actually. So if, when you read your slides, you look at all the sort of UK context, just to sort of fill those gaps in. Essentially, we got to a point where we're talking about people do move through this. They do get to a point where they're actually going forward with their life. There are ways forward, there are ways out of this. Very much as Ravi was talking about, the sort of readjustment going on and the embedding going on. This one is a very interesting quote because it's talking about somebody talking about their experiences of working with a lot of asylum seekers. You have to readjust. Say, for example, if you've been the victim of rape in Pakistan, you're going to be accused of being unfaithful to your husband, possibly sentenced to die. 24 hours later, you're in London, and you're talking about your claim, you're talking about what it is you can do. And the interviewee was talking about how people go through these cultural somersaults where they're able to sort of, bring the culture that they've come from and turn it over and embed into the UK in order to sort of survive those forms of sexual violence. And I think this last line here is absolutely fantastic. It's amazing how happy people are when they realise that there's a way out of that type of cruelty. So there are ways to move forward. and there are ways to go on. Okay. So, some final thoughts. No conclusions as yet, but we know in the world refugees are mistrusted, and they mistrust back. That's a two-way street. Children have experienced child abuse and perhaps witnessed all manner of forms of abuse, torture, potentially the killing of others, and other life events that are bound to affect the way in which attachments can be made within foster care arrangements. Past persecution has quite often been by state agents, so the trust of officials may not be there. And they arrive into contexts of care and control and uncertainty. And disclosure within those contexts is quite difficult, be that disclosure of abuse, maltreatment or exploitation. And there's no reason why disclosure for children should be any faster than it is for other children, although the process that we go through here in the UK is about eliciting information fairly quickly. Trust can be othered or ethnicised, whatever you want to call it. In the process of displacement, the Karen hiding in the jungle, if they met a Burmese person, that would be just as bad as meeting potentially an official. You know, these are the things that you have to factor in as you go along. But we have to think about emplacement as well as displacement, and for foster carers, the present issues around language and culture and translating language and culture will be matched by the ambiguities of the past for children, the present mix of capabilities, vulnerabilities, resilience being presented in front of you, and knowledge that future disclosures will continue to occur, and thinking about how children can relay the types of information that are kind of a world away when they're doing that. Thank you.